Good afternoon, and welcome to Sensible Financial Planning's webinar, Managing Money as a Couple, Early Marriage, Living Happily Ever After. I'm Carrie Fristow, and I will be your moderator. Today, Sensible Financial's founder, Rick Miller, will talk about managing money as a couple in the early stage of marriage. Rick Miller holds a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago and started Sensible Financial over 20 years ago. He is also a certified financial planner. You can see all our past webinars on Sensible Financial's website at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. You can also register for upcoming webinars through a link in Sensible Financial's newsletter, which we'll publish later this month, or at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. There will be Q&A sections, 2 of them, and please submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Rick will answer as many questions as he has time for, as I said, once approximately midway through the webinar and once at the end. Unfortunately, he can't give personal advice in this setting because there just isn't time to gather the information and context necessary to do so. At the end of the webinar, we'll display Rick's contact information. Now, Rick will begin.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. Today, we're going to talk about living together as a couple in early marriage, and we've entitled it Living Happily Ever After. And we called it that because many fairy tales end with, and they lived happily ever after. What does that really mean? There's a sense in which it suggests that all you got to do is find the one and your future is set. But that's really probably not the case. How many perfect marriages do you know well? Even perfect celebrity marriages show stress and break. So let's think carefully about what they lived happily ever after means. And let's go word by word. They is you. In this tale, we're talking about you living happily ever after. And you is both of you. You're in this together, and you have to figure out together how to live happily ever after together. Sharing is involved, and that sharing involves work and resources, your time and your money. And you will agree, one way or another, either explicitly or implicitly, how to do all of this. Lived. Let's start by thinking through the big picture, or you should start by thinking through the big picture together. Are you going to have children? If you are, how many? It's a central question. And you don't want to be assuming that you know what the other person thinks. Then there's how much time together you're going to spend, how much time alone you're going to spend, time with friends that are shared, friends that are just yours, the role of religion in your marriage, your parents, your siblings, other relations, and then stuff versus experiences. Perhaps you think you know what each other thinks, but it's worth being specific. You might even want to think about writing it down together. Then, when you actually are living together, you have to decide how things are going to go day to day. And many couples just slide into this. One does the grocery shopping. Both buy from Amazon, but don't discuss it. One does the bills, one does the investments. Often, members of couples don't really discuss with each other what they're doing. I can't tell you how many couples in my practice I've seen who come in having been married 20 years, and we lay out how all of the spending adds up, and they look at each other surprised because they've never seen the whole picture. One of them works over here, one of them works over here, and they work away, but they don't really see what the sum total is. So as you're working together on this, it's good to be explicit, and it's good to decide how you are going to decide. How much data and information are you going to need for each other? How much time are you going to spend analyzing and thinking together? And then how are you going to develop and grow as decision makers working together? And I suggest that learning from experience here is very useful. And then having decided, you have to act. And you've got to decide how you're going to act on things together. Are you going to divide things up, divide and conquer? Are you going to do everything together? Usually people divide things up. But how are you going to decide who's going to do what? Are you going to decide based on who's good at it, who wants to do it? I say talent and skill versus enthusiasm. Is just because somebody's really good at it, they may not enjoy it. And then there's efficiency versus accompaniment. You can get it done fast and well, and separately, and that means that you've got more pure shared time together. But if you do it together, then you're sharing the work, and that can feel good. So ideally, what you'll do is find ways to accompany each other while doing what I call household work. For example, you do the laundry while I clean the house. We can interact a lot without getting in each other's way. How you spend your time structures your life. And deciding together how you will each spend your time is a very important part of your life. The fraction of time that you actually control is smaller than you may think. Your sleep, your work, your commute time, all this stuff here, that's probably more than half of your life. And so the time that you really control together is relatively small. And you have to decide how you're going to spend that to make the life you want. You can also expand the amount of work time or contract it. We're going to talk more about this later. But in general, more work time means more financial resources, but less personal time, less couple time. Your household work here influences your quality of life. How clean are you going to keep your clothes in your house? How fancy are the meals going to be that you're going to cook? And then your personal time, which is here, that influences, or I shouldn't say influences, that includes time that you spend pretty much by yourself at the gym with friends that are just yours, but it's time that you're not spending together. And that can be a source of conflict if you're not careful. Okay. Now, I'm going to suggest that your time is your life. And I'm going to expand on this idea that how you spend your time matters a lot in the quality of your life and how your life feels together. I'm going to use as an example, the leading example, which is whether or not you have children. If you have no children, then you don't have to spend time on childcare. This is empty. And there's lots of time for time together as a couple, time for yourself, time for friends and other family. Um, and but if you have children, and it takes an enormous amount of time. And as I went and looked for data on this, and there's a BLS, a Bureau of Labor Statistics study that says that infant care takes, are you sitting down, takes up to 80 hours a week. And it takes 60 hours a week for children 1 to 12. So if we look at how time is allocated here, and then we put children in, now, and this is an underestimate, right? I've said people are going to split the time, the 80 hours between them. So 40 hours a week each. But there's less time for just about everything else. There's less work time, less sleep time, less household work time, much less couple time, less personal time, maybe more social time, because you'll find, I bet, that your parents are all of a sudden more interested in spending time with you, really spending time with the grandchildren, right? But that's the only area in which you might see an uptick. And it's if they're helping to take care of the kids, that might be fine. But otherwise, well, I remember how much I enjoyed spending time with my parents, with my kids. Fun in limited doses. Okay, so you have to decide how you're going to spend your time together. And you can do that just by default. I'm going to suggest that it's worth spending time thinking it through and talking it through, deciding what your priorities are, deciding what's important to you, deciding how you're going to share the load of caring for children, let's say, or working for pay, how that's going to change, how much you're going to rely on outsourcing it, hiring people to help. And it's an ongoing process. And if you are able to communicate through your lives, through your marriage, and able to decide together, that's going to make things a lot more harmonious than if you can't. If things aren't right, if one or both feel that things aren't right in terms of time allocation, resentments can build up, and that can be very difficult to manage. So I'm a financial planner. We need to talk about money too. So time is your basic resource. Uh, Time is what you really have, what you really own. Uh, and but many things in life require money. And you get money by selling your time and skill, your services at work, and then you use the money. So you sell your services, you get money back in salary and compensation, and then you turn around and spend that money either now or later on stuff and services for your family. And the stuff and services that you buy requires household work from you to make them most valuable for your family. So, for example, if we think about meals, you can buy groceries, but then you've got to spend a lot of time cooking to make meals to turn them into nutrition for your family. Or you can order in, and then you got to spend time ordering and going picking up, or you can go to restaurants and then you spend time getting there and back. So there are different mixes of purchased resources in your time that you use to make meals. And the decisions that you make about how that mix is going to be has to integrate with the decisions that you make about how you're going to spend your time, how much work for pay you're going to do, how much time you're going to be able to spend at home. It's and you can make those decisions unconsciously, and people do. But the I'm going to suggest that the more thoughtful you are, and the more thoughtful you are together, the more satisfied you're going to be with how things actually work out. And the same thing applies with children and caring for children. You can care for your children yourself. You can hire childcare to help care for it for your children. In which case you're picking up and dropping off your kids, and you're managing the daycare, deciding which daycare to use, expressing your pleasure or displeasure with how the care is delivered, and so forth. At the extreme, you can hire a nanny, but that takes even more management and is more expensive. It's more purchase time. And again, that mix is going to influence the amount of time that you spend with your kids, how you feel about it, and also the amount of resources that you have to devote to the rest of your life. More broadly, you decide for yourself how you're going to divide your time between household work and work. From, at the extreme, we could imagine you're living off the grid, you're not doing any work for pay, and you're growing your own food, making your own clothes, and so forth, to at the other extreme, you're working all the time and hiring services to do everything. And somewhere in the middle is where you and your spouse want to be. But you have to work on that together and figure it out together. So that's living. Now, how to live happily together. I will say that the couples that I see that are the happiest are the ones that are able to make decisions and move on. So revisiting decisions over and over and not making progress is painful. And my experience is that the people who are sort of revisiting decisions all the time are people that didn't agree on the big stuff at the beginning. And so they're kind of still trying to decide the big things when they're already in the middle of it. And it's really hard to change some of the big decisions that they've made, maybe by default. But agreeing on the big decisions can make the smaller decisions easier because you can just refer back to your big decisions and priorities. And one of the biggest decisions is work-life balance. We're going to talk more about that as later in this section. And agreement on work-life balance promotes harmony, and disagreement can be a real problem. And I can think of a celebrity situation that resonates here in Massachusetts. You've probably perhaps heard of Tom Brady and Gisele Bundchen. And Tom wanted more work, and Gisele wanted more life, and that was the end of their marriage eventually. So thinking those things through together and agreeing them together is very important. Okay, now strategic money decisions uh, determine the shape of your life. And I've listed them on the page here, the jobs you'll do, how much that means for how much you'll earn, how much time the jobs will take, how much you're going to spend on these items and the mix among them, and how much you'll save. Those are strategic decisions. You're going to implement them kind of every year. And I have a story here too, which has stuck with me for a long time. When I was right out of college, my wife and I was recently married. My wife and I went to a concert with um, the fiance of a friend of mine who was a bit older. And this is a Saturday evening. And um, the plan was that we were going to have dinner and then go to this concert. And my friend was working to become a senior executive at the firm that he was working at. And it was a Saturday, and dinner was at 6. And he called at 5:30 to say he was sorry he wasn't going to be able to make dinner, but he would join us at the concert. And long story short, he ended up meeting us for the last half hour of the concert because he was working so hard to move forward in his company. And that was a decision that he made about work time versus personal time. And I continued to see it throughout his career. Um, and that was a decision that really structured how much time he was able to spend with his fiance and then with his wife. And I wasn't familiar with all of the details of how the relationship worked. I'm hopeful that they thought that through together uh, actively, rather than having different expectations on one side and the other. Other examples of big decisions are big house versus small house. You've heard of people who are house poor. Those are people who spend a very high percentage of their resources on their house, and then they have less left for everything else. And again, that's a decision that you want to make carefully if that's something that you're going to do. Then there are daily money decisions, what I call daily money decisions, and they determine what I call the texture of your life. What will your life together feel like? Um, do you both agree that a big bonus is important this quarter, this year? What about a promotion? Um, are you going to do live entertainment? Tickets to a live concert can cost as much as a whole year of Hulu. That's a decision that you make. Do I want one? Do I want the other? Do we want one? Do we want the other? Uh, More takeout can mean beans and rice the rest of the time. So all of those for the same budget give you a different feel to your life, and it's important to decide and agree which where you want to end up on each dimension of that you have to decide about. And now we're going to move on to work-life balance. What is work good for? You see the list here, and you can interpret and specify for yourself what each one means to you and how you value it. And your spouse has a similar set of considerations that they interpret and specify for themselves. Dignity and purpose and meaning, and you can get a lot of those from work, are essential to a good life, but they're just part of life. And then here's life, and it's called life, right? But it's life away from work, because time at work is life too. But still, when people talk about work-life balance, they're really talking about life at work versus life at home or away from work. And again, these are elements of life that have value, life away from work, and you can interpret and specify, and you should interpret and specify for yourself what each of them means to you. And from my own life, I have experience coaching my kids in sports, and I did that for about 10 years with each of them, and that was really fun. And it contributed to not just my kids' growth, but other kids' growth. But it didn't, generated zero income. I got a zero paycheck, although I got a few gifts and gift cards. But that was an element of life that I was able to fit in to my work life, or my work schedule, I guess is the best way to put it. There were other work schedules that wouldn't have accommodated that. And so that's making a decision about work dictates what's possible in life, or making a decision about what you require in life then has implications for what kinds of work you can do and what kinds of roles you can take on. So work-life balance embodies the dual nature of marriage. And I talked in the previous webinar about the two important aspects of marriage. I won't say the two, but two important aspects of marriage: money and your relationship. And there's a really clear trade-off when you're talking about work and life balance. More work means more money, means more stuff and services for you and your family. More life means better developed family relationships, better personal relationships. But you can't have all of both. There are trade-offs here, and they're important trade-offs. And agreeing together what you want will make life better. Not agreeing on this is likely to lead to conflict, and it can be a real issue in marriages. Okay, Carrie, we can take questions here if there are any.
Yes, we do have a couple questions. The first one is someone asks, are there any tools that could speed the planning and give an overall view of money? Are there any tools that you could use to do this planning?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about that in the second section. I'll talk about some tools, and the tools I'm going to talk about are conceptual, but I will also talk about software that you can use that will give you a picture of the tools, and will help you put the finances of your relationship in quantitative terms, so that you can talk about these decisions with each other.
Okay. There's another question. This one's from Elaine, who wants to know how she can be more strategic in her decisions with money, because in her past she didn't have a lot of money, and so now she feels that she's she's making emotional decisions about money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, this, I think, refers back to the question about tools. I think that if you want to make thoughtful decisions about money, then it's important to and money is, after all, a quantitative domain, right? There's money is denominated in numbers, and it's not just that 100, let's say, is more than 10, but 100 is 10 times 10, for example. And so if you're making a decision about whether this is 100 and this is 10, and which one is better, it's also how much better. And it's hard to make those decisions on an emotional basis, because 100 sounds like a lot more than 10, and it is a lot more than 10, right? But it's not 100 times more than 10. It's 10 times more than 10. And so you need a tool that will help you identify how much more one is than another. And you also need a tool, and I think there are two kinds of decisions that really benefit from quantitative support. The first one is when you're comparing what's called a stock to a flow, or when you're comparing, let's say, an asset to an income, or a big purchase to a monthly expenditure. So if you're thinking about buying a house in Massachusetts, you're talking about spending 500,000 plus. And if you're talking about, but if you think about how much you spend in a month, you might be spending, $4, 5, 6, 7, $8,000 a month. How do you compare those two things? You need a tool that will translate the asset, the house, into a monthly expense, so that you can figure out how that fits in your budget. So that's really important. And it's easy to make I shouldn't say it's easy to make, but emotions can really sneak in when you're thinking about something like a house, because it has a lot of meaning, more than just how much it costs. But if you can translate the house, the price of the house, into a monthly cost, that makes it much easier to make a rational decision. The second area where it's very difficult for us as people to make decisions, good, rational, quantitative decisions, is when we're thinking about, let's say, retirement, something that's way in the future. And it's really hard to conceptualize how much, let's say, you should save. And again, a quantitative tool can really be helpful to translate, let's say, how much you want to spend each year in the future into how much you need to be saving now, every month. And it's much easier for someone to fit a monthly saving figure into their budget than it is to say, well, I need to save $1 million, which sounds impossible.
Okay, here's one from Elena. So what is the best way and the best time to approach these conversations with our partner?
That is a really good question. I think that it is possible to think of these as very romantic conversations, because they are about your future together. And so it may be as much about how you position the conversation as it is about when. But I think you want to have time to spend. This is not a off the cuff 2-minute discussion, but it doesn't have to be a 4-hour discussion either. It can be a series of discussions, and in fact, it's really a lifetime of discussions. And when you're just starting out, the future seems limitless, and it seems as though you're kind of never going to get there, and everything is all in the future, right? But I think that if you can start with the high level first, and say, these are kind of the big things we need to agree on this. Like, are we going to have kids? How many are we going to have? That's a kind of a romantic discussion. But then you eventually you need, and we're going to talk about this in the next section, you need to get down to the implications for your life, because it's I can't sort of emphasize enough how seemingly small decisions can have big implications for um, for your life. You know, well, let's have kids. Everybody has kids. Well, but it's a big deal, and I'm going to show you how it's a big deal in just a minute. And you've got an inkling from just how much time it takes. And so um, uh, I think that to the extent that you can get on the same page with your partner about, you know, just how important this is for us to have a good life together, I think that's also helpful. And then at the end, we have a couple of books that people can look at. I'll mention those um, as a way to maybe as thought starters as well. And Carrie, I think we ought to move back to the material because we have a lot of ground still to cover.
There's another question, but we can answer that in the Q&A at the end. So don't
Okay,
worry,
great.
we're not ignoring you.
Okay, very good. All right. Okay, so now we've been through they lived happily, and now we're to ever after. And ever after is the part I think that where we have the most to say as financial planners and financial advisors, because ever after is the rest of your life, and it includes lots of life phases, and it includes lots of different kinds of experience, and each of these areas is demanding. It demands a lot of each of you and your relationship. But let's start with just how long is ever after? Long. It's long. If let's say you're 25 and you're just starting in marriage and maybe you're a little older, if this span of ever after, it could be 3 times as long as you've been alive. You'll raise your kids if you have kids. If you're going to have kids at some point, we hope you'll live to see them be older than you are now, maybe even until they have children of their own, maybe even until you're older than your parents are now. And this is your financial advisor speaking. So I can ask for the drum roll, please. It's all connected. If you take one thing away from this discussion today, it's that it's all connected. Your life stages connect, and decisions that you make now influence the rest of your life in very direct ways. And there's an equation here about how that happens. And then there are a couple of observations that I think are very important about this. One of them is you can spend your resources only once. So it may seem that, for example, well, you're earning this year and you're earning next year, so you can spend everything that you earn next year or this year, you can spend everything this year that you make this year because you're going to earn more next year. But you could use the money that you earn this year at any point in your life. And by deciding to spend it now, you're deciding not to spend it later. And that's a bigger decision than you might think. And that is a great example of the fact that today's actions influence tomorrow's choices. And you can see the equation here about tomorrow's resources being today's resources plus whatever you earn minus whatever you spend. And that's also true. But that again, the big point is that it's all connected. So what does that really mean, and what can you do about it? So let's start by understanding better what I call the fundamental financial planning problem. And the fundamental financial planning problem is right here. At some point, your income stops and your spending doesn't, or at least you don't want it to, right? If you're going to retire, you'd like to not have to stop spending. And the way to make that work is that while you're working, you spend less than you earn. And all of this, save, and then after you retire, you get to spend it. So that's the best example, or perhaps the most memorable example, of how today's decisions affect tomorrow's opportunities. Because if you say, well, no, I'm not going to save anything, I'm going to spend at this level and not save anything, well, when you get to this point, you're not going to have anything to spend after you retire. Leaving aside Social Security now for a minute, but which is, I don't mean to ignore that completely, but if you don't save anything, then all you'll have is Social Security, and you may want more than that. Other decisions have lifetime implications too, and let's look at the biggest one. And I've hinted at this. This is not going to be such a big reveal. A major decision is whether or not you're going to have children, and here are the big questions. Yes or no, when, who will take care of them. There's also how many, and whatever decisions you make here, there are big financial implications, and there are implications for the rest of your married life too, for your relationship and for your family and all of that sort of thing. But I'm a financial planner, and so I'm going to focus on those financial implications. So let's start really simply. Let's start with no children, and you're going to see this same graph here. This is what I showed you before. Each spouse earns $60,000 a year, works full time. They plan to retire at 65 here. They smooth spending. There's no inflation. There's a 2% risk-free rate of return. And what that means then is they're going to save about $35,000 a year. I can't draw that. I can't write it. 35, not fast enough. So they're going to spend 85, and then when they retire, they're going to still be able to spend 85,000. And I figured out what the number should be. So it's right. It's actually right, because they save for 40 years. They're only going to spend for 35 years. They get a 2% rate of return, which doesn't sound like much, but is actually quite significant. And that allows them to spend at the same level throughout their retirement. And how does that work? Well, their savings, you remember I said they'd save, it's about 35,000, and those savings add up and they get return on those. You see that it's got a little upward bend to it. That's the extra return they get. And then when they retire, they draw the savings down and they spend all their assets by the end of retirement. And notice that in this case, no kids, working to 65, they save a little bit over $2 million. And they're spending about 85,000. Okay. Now, let's put kids in. And the big deal with kids, there are two big deals actually. One of them is that children cost money, right? You have to feed them, you have to have space for them, you have to drive them around. I remember a guy I used to work for was disappointed that no one pointed out to him that when he went from 3 children to 4 children, he had to go from a sedan to a minivan, and that was a big expense. But that's the least of it, I promise you. But that the big expense for childcare is actually, and we'll see this in a minute, that you got to spend time taking care of them. We saw that earlier, right? That it's 60 to 80 hours a week. So how are you going to do that? And there's several strategies. You can have one spouse devoting full time. You can have one spouse devoting part time and hire childcare, or you can hire a full time childcare. You could hire a nanny and have both spouses work full time. I'm not going to show you this one. So we're going to look at the financial implications of that. And the first thing is the lower income, right? So if in the case where we have one spouse working full time and one spouse spending full time with the children, then there's only one spouse working. And income goes from up here from 120 to 60. That's a lot less. And even if we've got a spouse who's working part-time and who, let's say, works maybe half-time until the children are 10, and then works 3/4 time until the children are in college and then goes back to work full time, still the income's a lot lower. There's all this income here that they don't get. And just a little side point here is that often if one spouse decides that they're going to take care of the children full time, they plan that they're going to go back to work when the kids reach a certain age. And that happens much less frequently than people plan. Because going back to work after 10 or 15 years completely out of the market is very hard because your skills are dated, you got to rebuild your network. So if they're planning, let's say, to go back to work, but then it doesn't happen, then all this income out here is lost. And that's also part of the cost of household work and childcare. And in addition to the foregone earnings cost, children are also expensive. You've got to feed them, house them. And if you've got part-time childcare, then there's also extra cost of that. So here we've just got the cost of the children being at home and feeding them. And here we've got childcare cost on top of that. And these are made up numbers. So just look at the shape of the graph. Don't hold me to the numbers. These resources for childcare and for the kids have to come from somewhere. And the only place they have to come from is spending on the spouses when the kids aren't there. And more spending also means less saving. So here, remember that the couple with no kids ended up with about $2 million in savings. If we've got one spouse working, then we're going to end up with more like $1 million in savings. And if you've got one spouse working part-time and one spouse working full-time, then we've got like $1.25 million in savings. But notice that the couples that are planning to have kids and planning not to work full-time have to save more early than the couple that's not planning to have children. And that means that they can spend less. They're going to spend less than the couple that's not having children, because they got to kind of save up for the cost of children and then save up to cover the saving that they can't do while they have kids. And if they have part-time childcare, even though they save up extra, when the part-time spouse is working, the spouse that's staying home but only part-time is doing that, then they don't have to keep the savings as much, because when the spouse that has been staying part-time at home goes back to work, then they can accelerate their savings and get back so that they have more. And if you're thinking about this is an area where getting an advisor to help you think this through could be helpful. It's a big decision, and thinking about how much time you want to have one spouse stay out of the workforce, let's say, and take care of your children, has financial implications. So it's not bad to have quantitative thought about that. It can support your decision making. Okay, so I've said this a couple of times, but I'll say it one more time. And this slide is in fact drawn from the last webinar. Unlike in fairy tales, love alone does not make a strong marriage. Love and money both matter. Not just love, not just money, which this section is going to focus on, or is focusing on. And your happiness in your life is going to depend on your personal relationship, your ability to work together on your finances, and your satisfaction with your work-life balance, your money and life mix. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about money. We've looked at how money changes over time. How can you tell where you are? And I'm going to show you a concept called the lifetime balance sheet. And it's it's something that you can find in a piece of software called Maxify. That software that we use, there's a consumer version available. I think it's a really nifty tool, um, and we use it all the time. I think it's relatively easy to understand, but I've been doing this for a long time and I'm an economist. So maybe I'm just thinking about me, but I'm going to suggest that it's something that's worth looking at for you as well. Um, so um, your money in the lifetime balance sheet is your resources after tax and protected. So with insurance. So we're not going to talk much about taxes here, and we're not going to talk much about insurance. We're going to talk a little bit about insurance. They're both important. And I think that the lifetime balance sheet is helpful in understanding how they're important and whether or not it's something that you can do something about. So here is an example lifetime balance sheet. And this is for the married couple. And this is kind of a hodgepodge married couple. They're both working full time, but they're going to have college costs, but no other childcare costs. Just so I can show you everything on the lifetime balance sheet. And I've put in taxes and I put in Social Security so that we have those on the lifetime balance sheet as well. So, what does a lifetime balance sheet do? It adds up. It's a big adding machine, and it adds up your lifetime resources and your lifetime spending. So you can compare them to each other. And if you're 25, your lifetime resources are your future earnings and the social security benefits that you're going to receive. So here's lifetime earnings, here's social security benefits. And then what about the committed spending that you have, what the spending that you're gonna do? And here there are three big categories. There's housing here, the light blue. There's the taxes you're going to pay. And then here there are special expenses. And I've made them be college, but they could be all kinds of things. It could be a second home. It could be a big vacation that you're planning to take in the future. It could be specific charitable contributions that you're going to make. There are all kinds of things. They all count as committed. And if you take your total resources and subtract your committed spending, you're left with what you can spend on day-to-day living, or what we call discretionary spending. So you can use this chart to see lots of things. You could say, well, what if we spend more on housing, right? So that's going to make this bigger, and it's going to force this to be smaller. What about expensive versus inexpensive college? Again, expensive college is going to make this bigger, and it's going to force this to be smaller. There are many different ways to organize your life and many different ways to organize your spending, and they have implications for how your life will be. And my favorite example of this, I'll try to go relatively quickly. We auctioned off a plan as a charitable contribution, and the people that bought it were school teachers in Boston, and we did the plan for them, and we put in college, and we said, boy, this is going to be just really difficult and we put in private college, and we put in um, sort of standard expenses for children, and we put in childcare expenses, and they said, well, that's really interesting, but that's not what we're going to do. We're gonna live in a smaller house than you assumed, and the kids are going to live two to a bedroom. We're going to have 4 kids, but they're going to live two to a bedroom, and we're going to get hand-me-down clothes from our families, and the kids are going to go to state schools, and it's all going to be fine. And you run the plan that way, and it is going to be fine. It's a different plan than many clients that we work with would make, but it works. And so the allocation of your resources to different categories of spending change the way your life looks. It changed the way your life feels. And working at this level, at this summary level, can really help you think that through. Okay, now there's another thing that this is good for. It's good for lots of things, but this is the other thing that I'm going to emphasize, and that is, what are the risks here? Well, the biggest risk here is that something happens to your income. If something happens to your income, you're in big trouble. And what could happen? You could die. Oh, well, you're not going to die, but some people do, and it's if it should happen to be you, then and you have kids, then your spouse could be in big trouble. So you need life insurance. And this really makes clear why you need life insurance. What if you can't work? What if you get sick? You need for insurance to protect you against that. That's long-term disability insurance. You need that too, because this is a big asset. Now, these are 30-year-olds. Well, they've got a little bit of savings, assets here. They can afford to take a lot of risk, because suppose they put all their money in stocks and the market drops to zero and this evaporates. It's only 2%. Not a big deal. Later on, as we'll see, it could be a very big deal. Now, there's another way to look at investment risk, and that is we can add to this table, this chart over here. This is what we call sustainable spending. This is the amount that you can afford to spend on day-to-day living, on discretionary needs. But we could look at what you're actually spending, and suppose that you're actually spending this, then you've got extra surplus. That's money that you could afford to lose. That says you can afford to take risk, investment risk. Not that you have to, but you can afford to. So this lifetime balance sheet is really very informative about lots of decisions that people tend to feel uncertain about. Provides a lot of information. Okay, now the lifetime balance sheet changes as you get older, and I'm going to sort of flip through it. So this is for a 25-year-old, and we've seen this, high earnings or value of future earnings. Everything's in the future. Social Security benefits relatively small. That's the present value of the Social Security benefits that we expect the person will have. Taxes are large here. Housing costs are large. We've got these college expenses coming up. And discretionary expenses over the lifetime is almost $2 million. Now, move to 50-year-old. Now, future discretionary expenses, present value is only $1.5 million. Resources earnings are a smaller percentage of the total. Assets are larger. Taxes are smaller, and housing is smaller. And these special expenses are closer. But notice that even at 50, the assets are comfortably less than half of total resources. So there's still risk that's available to take. Now let's move on. And here's 70. No future earnings anymore. And these assets are large. And if something happens to these, that's a big problem in terms of this discretionary spending. So the amount of risk that's affordable is likely smaller. So here's a way to visualize the saying, which isn't always true, by the way, but there's some truth in it, that the older you are, the less investment risk you can afford. Okay, so we're in the home stretch here. You could spend all of today's resources today. Living paycheck to paycheck seems easy. There's no thought required, but unfortunately, there are really unpleasant consequences. And even the smallest negative surprise is a shock to your financial system. And then secondly, if you take the long-term view, when your paychecks stop, what do you do then? Because paycheck to paycheck to nothing means that's really hard. So when we think about living within your means, we're thinking about living within your lifetime means. And that requires at least a rough lifetime budget, right? So much saved for college, so much saved for retirement. You can do something like this for yourselves. I'd encourage you, if you're doing it, to be cautious. People tend to be optimistic. They tend to, in particular, they tend to underestimate the cost of home ownership. So that's something to really focus on. Um, Borrowing, carrying a balance into the next month on your credit cards is not a good idea, except in emergencies, because when you borrow, you're spending tomorrow's money today. And that's okay, as it says here, for houses and cars, because with houses, you're spending, you're borrowing, but that borrowing's kind of covering tomorrow's housing cost. And with the car, the borrowing can be covering tomorrow's house or car services. But when you borrow on your credit card to buy a vacation, let's say, you're using and you carry the balance into next year, you've used next year's income to buy this year's vacation. Probably not a good idea. In effect, that's worse than paycheck to paycheck. You're like spending tomorrow's paycheck today. And then when you get to tomorrow, eventually you run out of tomorrow's. And I like to say life is too short to worry about money. And when you're stretching your resources, the worry can be constant. So it's just, we really advise against it. Last thing, staying organized. From a financial perspective, your marriage is like a small business. You're running a small business. And you'll be much more likely to succeed if you keep track of your spending, at least month to month, making sure that your outgo is less than your income. And if you have a savings target, and I think it's a good idea to have one, are you meeting it? And then keep track of your assets. Well, 401ks are real money. I can't tell you how many people I've seen, how many clients have come in and we ask them about the 401ks and they say, oh, I've got one, I used to work at X and the 401k is still there. And well, how big is it? Well, I don't really know. And what's it invested in? I'm not sure. That makes you much less likely that you'll be successful, because your assets are important. They're what you're going to live on in retirement, and uh, uh, if they're set aside for college and you're not sure how they're invested and how much there is relative to what you're going to spend, again, it could be problematic. So keeping track of the assets is important too. And I don't think you need a super complicated uh, system to do this, and you don't have to update it all the time. But looking at it, looking at your assets once or twice a year is a good idea. And having a sense of how it's progressing is a really good idea. And finally, are your assets invested consistently with the risk you can afford and the risk that you're comfortable with? Okay, Carrie, we are really running close here. We're a little over, actually. So, but we can take a couple of questions, and if people are interested, and then we can talk about the resources and sum up.
Okay, absolutely. I will say that if somebody asked if we would tell them, give them links to the books that you're going to recommend, but that's coming up. So, one of the people asks, is there an optimal time in the age graph to have children? In addition, if
yes, this is a great question. This is a great
if you
question.
intend to have more than
Okay.
one child,
Okay.
what's the ideal age gap?
Okay. So the ideal age gap, I have no idea.
The ideal age gap, not for the development of the children, but
right.
to create room for financial stability.
I see. Okay. Well, there are a couple things here. I mean, first of all, if you want to know your grandchildren, well, then having kids earlier rather than later is indicated. So that's the first thing. And that's a life consideration. It's not a money consideration, but it's a fact, right? If you have your kids when you're 40 and they have their kids when they're 40, then you're going to be 80 when your grandkids are born. Whereas if you have your kids in your 20s and they have their kids in their 20s, then you're going to be 50. That's really different. And that's a big consideration. It's a personal consideration, but it's a big consideration. If you have your children early, then your earnings will be relatively low, and so that and if you plan that both of you are going to be committed to the workforce, and that um, uh, uh, the one, if there is one of you that's going to spend more time on childcare, they're going to sort of keep their network going and their earning power up and so forth. And then when the kids are out of the house, then they're going to really jump back in and and grow their career. Then having your kids early can be effective from a financial perspective, because your high earning years, you sort of held on to those high earning years, and that allows you to save more after the kids are out of the house, and that allows you to um, uh, uh, generate good assets to allow you to support a higher level of spending throughout your life. So, that's kind of the ideal, especially if both of you have careers that allow you to mix or do both childcare and work in the market. Um, that's a that's a that's kind of the best I can do in a short period of time. It's very person specific.
Sure. One of the things, another question is, what are ways of navigating these decisions when you're not really sure what you want long term? I mean,
Ah,
not everyone knows what they want for their future when they're 20.
they don't, and that's fair. I
Mhm.
think still then I would say the first thing to do is to not make any big commitments um, until you have some idea of what you want them to be. And so you can, if you don't know, take some time and think it through and figure it out. And um, you have time to try things and see if there's something that you particularly enjoy or an approach that you particularly appreciate. So I think it's probably a mistake to rush to decide, um, and people's minds change, right? And so that can be okay. But being open with your spouse about how you're thinking about things and what your uncertainties are and so forth, and trying to figure things out together, I think is a good approach.
One more, and it's a quickie. Do you consider 401ks as assets here?
Absolutely, absolutely. They don't belong to anybody but you, and um, uh, and and I'll do one more little plug here. If your employer contributes to your 401k and matches your contributions, be sure to contribute yourself, because if you don't get your employer's match, you're leaving money on the table, and it's your money. There's no question that it's your money. Okay, so let's move on here to the conclusion. Um, I'm going to give you some takeaways here, and then we'll talk about the books and the tools. So um, they lived happily ever after. Fairy tales are popular because they express shared wishes and worries. Unfortunately, fairy godmothers and perfect royal spouses aren't real. You have to build your own life together. The first step is to recognize that living as a couple requires a change in mindset from living as an individual. Knowing what you want, telling your spouse what you want and hearing what they want, adapting to each other, and then spending with intention. Spending something now means you can't spend it later, and living within your lifetime means is a very important element of a, at least in my opinion, of a happy and relatively worry-free life. Okay, books. Here are two books. Uh, I have not read either of them all the way through, but The Pi Life is about time allocation, and I think it's a set of useful perspectives. And then The Family Firm by Emily Oster or Oster, I guess. I've read a good deal of this. And while it looks like it's about running your family as a business, it's actually about making decisions together, or largely about making decisions together, and then uh, operating your life according to those decisions and how to do it. I think it's a really nice set of perspectives. In terms of tools, for the lifetime balance sheet, the piece of software is called Maxify. It's not free, but it's, I think, less than $100 a year. Um, it's good for planning. It's not good for managing because it doesn't have uh, sort of month-to-month detail, and it doesn't do anything with you can't connect it to your financial institutions. Uh, I like Quicken as a way of managing income and expense. Uh, if you're going to use Quicken, I would emphasize keeping it simple. Don't put in lots of categories. Don't try to get too fancy. You're just trying to get an overall picture of what your financial situation is. It can be a time sink if you make it too detailed. Okay, we've got webinars coming up. The first one is the 5 biggest Medicare mistakes you can make, and that's at the end of February on the 29th, taking advantage of the fact that 2024 is a leap year, and then a webinar about estate planning on March 27th. And we will hope to see you